In trying to come up with a new design for the alien technologies in the movie, I started by going back to the original film, and what was interesting to me about the original film, looking at it even now, was that the spaceship that Klaatu comes in, the space suit that he wears, and Gort himself, there's a real visual connection between them. And so that was a starting point for me, that I wanted to try to find a way to tie in a visual sense of these three things, and for them to feel like they don't really belong to the world, but they do belong to each other. And the most challenging of those things, of course, was Gort. The first drafts that were written of the script, at least the first drafts that I saw, he wasn't even referred to as Gort, and it was very abstract.
My first take on Gort was I saw the forms as very primal. I mean, one of the movies that I watched sort of preparing for this was 2001. Meaning, in 2001, the Black Monolith was basically this iconic, pure, very, very minimal form.
There was not a lot of description of him, so I didn't know what he was going to end up looking like. And I think that's one of the reasons why we set off in so many unusual directions looking for good ideas.
The thing about Gort is, and this is part of the trick of the original movie, Gort is such sort of a classic, iconic figure, and yet he's so 1950s. But I was never sure that you could necessarily pull it off in 2008. So we sort of did a lot of tinkering and thinking about what that would be today.
The process began with a number of artists. Aaron was probably the principal one that I worked with early on.
When I met Scott Derrickson about the project, his main thing he wanted to focus on was Gort and figuring out what Gort was going to look like. And at that time, the character was called the Idol. And originally, the Idol was just supposed to be this character that it was Gort. But what he wanted to achieve with that was something that was very different, alien looking in its technology, but not feel like it was built as a robot of any sort. It was just some kind of a creature. Was it organic, or was it environmental, or was it some kind of hybrid of some kind of a mixture of things? And ultimately we find out it's made of these nanos, so it could be any shape. But he wanted to keep it with a humanoid or biped design, just basically so that we could identify with it as an audience member. Our first designs were somewhat humanoid, but they were very different in their shape. Very strange looking heads, and the body, had interesting structure, but very sculptural looking, not mechanical looking. It was more like it was made of stone of some sort. It was kind of the first approach. And designing, especially an alien technology, is that as part of a design process usually is to try every possibility. A lot of it was just a textural thing. But for the most part, it's exploring so many different possibilities because you're dealing with an alien technology. Eventually then we decided to go into a non-human approach, which was playing around and exploring so many different shapes, multiple legs, stuff that was just as intimidating as, having the no face, but it goes even further.
And when I got on the show and they laid out the new Gort for me, inside I was somewhat upset. Outside and the professional point of view, I was trying to go with the program. Some of the stuff that I brought to the table with it is the old Swiss Army knife analogy that if he's a robot, if he's made up out of the nanobots, or aphids as we began to call them, then why is he restricted to normal joint action? Why can't he not fold in upon himself or even move through himself? So that kicked it off in a new direction. And then I was getting very excited because we were doing things that are just really cool to do. And we evolved several creatures that are amazing, that none of them are Gort. We added tentacles to this guy, but the tentacles were a different kind of tentacle that came out of, his forehead, and he was a four-legged creature, and he sort of rotated instead of walked, and his limbs were made out of razor blade sharp edges so that he was death, it was just like your worst nightmare.
We went through every possible iteration of Gort imaginable. Gort had more shapes and sizes than you can possibly imagine.
I am embarrassed to admit it, but I had no immediate sense that I had to stick closely to the original design. I wanted to explore other possibilities, and we tried all kinds of concept art, and it became increasingly strange and bizarre, and until finally I was looking at images that looked like they belonged in the Museum of Modern Art. I remember very clearly being in the pre-production offices up in Vancouver and talking about the look of Gort, and specifically looking at an image of a metallic-looking, four-legged, smooth form that had no head and no tail and no real personality to it. And I remember Jeff Oken just kind of very humbly and very quietly saying, I think we just need to go back closer to the original design of the first movie.
And we're looking at this image of Gort, and in the bottom corner they put a little man so that we could see the scale of Gort. And everyone's talking about it, and I'm looking at this little guy down there, and finally it was my turn to talk, and I said, I have something very unpopular to say, but you know, I don't think Gort's here. I think Gort's that little guy in the bottom corner, and here's why. And I gave this whole little spiel about Gort is actually a Rorschach test. Gort is from another planet, right? So why would he come here looking like something that is completely alien to us, especially if he has the power to turn into anything he wants to turn into? You know, why would they send that? Why would they not send something that's more akin to the monolith in 2001 in that it's a humanoid shape, but it has no emotion? So you don't know if you're afraid of it, you don't know if you're in love with it. There was this very uncomfortable shocked silence in the room for, to me it was 2,000 or 3,000 years, and then Irwin said, I've been thinking the same thing.
The more Gorts we looked at, the more confused we became, because they all seemed random.
And we have a huge fan base who are in love with Gort. Gort is an iconic robot. And you look at that robot, and in a sense, he is the 2001 monolith. He has no emotions. And this little character that Weta had put down there had no face. So I thought it was perfect. And then one by one, everybody came out of the closet, so to speak, and said, you're right.
It was just one of those moments of clarity, and it was so obvious that we had completely run off course.
We basically broomed Gort off the table and said, all right, so now let's design a Gort that is actually, you know, we've drifted far afield, let's get back to a more humanoid version of him, more of an homage to the original one.
This would have been probably about maybe 2 or 3 months before we started shooting. And so there was enough time to reconceptualize all of it.
At this point, Scott and David Brisbane immediately got Aaron on the phone and said, Bulletin, we need a new Gort. He's humanoid, and here's the things. He has to be imposing, and he has to be blank. And he has to be able to have body posture so that he can have emotion without emotion. And other than that, we don't know what color he is. We don't know what he's made of. We don't know how he moves. We know nothing about him. Go to work. And so literally 2 hours later, we got images of Gort, the first ones from Aaron Sims, and there was stuff in there that just resonated with people, and we slowly began the work of refining Gort.
And the rest is the long, arduous process of the details of getting it to look the way that we wanted it to look.
It was basically starting off with the original Gort body figure, where it was like a humanoid, no face, the slit eye, very simple structure, and from there explored different shapes to the body, like, you know, some concaved rib cages, to the different shapes of the head, to how big was he going to be scale-wise, but also how massive would he feel? Would he be this thin character? Would he be a thick character? So we explored so many possibilities in that area. And, you know, it came to where I wanted him to be bigger than the original, but what we ended up with is very close to the original Gort, with having the laser eye, you know, that we're all so familiar with. So it was basically just left at keeping him as simple as possible.
What, in my opinion, made the original Gort so powerful was its intractable stillness, that it was this monolithic, intractable, inscrutable thing that didn't need to do a lot, because it really primarily reacted. And if it wasn't reacting, it was just still. And that stillness was where its power and force came from. And I liked the idea of trying to go back to that simple idea.
Working on Gort was interesting because we were trying to come up with an idea that blended the classic design of the original character with something that was a little bit more up-to-date and modern.
Gort at first appears to be a robot or something we are familiar with from other movies, and then eventually turns into something completely different.
One of the things is he has to be the fail-safe mechanism, and ultimately in this film, destroy the world. So how's he going to do that? Nanobots. He's made of nanobots.
It's maybe a community of robots. It's a hive of robots that basically breaks into a million pieces and becomes a swarm.
When we decided to go back to more of the original design of Gort, it was about finding that place where we could take David's idea of him turning into this cloud of devouring nanotechnology aphids, what we would sometimes call them, and how do we take that and back that up into a Gort that has some respect for the original design.
My designs of the nanos is that even though it's alien, there needs to be something familiar. So I gravitated with that towards more of a insect-based approach.
When you see the actual nanobots, they're very efficient consuming metallic creatures. And they have wings because they have to fly, and they're razor-sharp wings, and so he is all of that.
Scott really didn't want to give away that there was this technology, but there could be hints of it. You know, some slight stuff where the surface is moving slightly, constantly, and it's like, why is it moving?
We spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to introduce that effect, how to hint to the audience that this is what was really going to be coming later on, but also to not give it away too much. Trying to get that balance of Gort's physical structure and his aphids was probably one of the trickiest parts of working out his design, because the aphids are something that you see in motion. The Gort sequence that took the longest to achieve was the sequence where we first see him arrive. Because you see him in so many different aspects. You see him close up, you see him surrounded by the light of the sphere, you see him striding forward. And so it's really where we got to pick out how we thought he was going to look as a solid form, how he was going to work in motion, and how we were going to hint at the idea that he's made of all these aphids, and just trying to work out the proper balance so that we weren't giving too much away or also just not being too distracting.
We chased our tails for a while before we came to our senses and got on the right path. And once we got on the right path, it was still a long road, trying to find something that was, interesting and could be done. And so keeping, again, that blend between the technological and the biological was the challenge, finding something that felt like it was a robot, but didn't feel like it was a robot from an industrial civilization. It was from something else.
What was interesting for me is it went from a job of sheer terror of, oh my God, this is nothing like Gort, to elation and at feeling that we've actually created a Gort that pays homage to the original Gort and fulfills all of his missions for this movie.
It's all based on something subjective, on instincts and so on. But now, in having seen the completed movie, we now know that we're right in having paid a certain homage to who the original Gort was.
I hope the fans really like what they see, as well as, people that aren't familiar with the film, see exactly what they're supposed to see and feel when they see Gort. Basically just being a menacing, cold figure that eventually will kill us all.